Before we start with the questions, I'd like to ask Peter Styring and Julia Carrell, our other two panel members, to briefly introduce themselves and the work which they do. So perhaps, Julia, if we could start with you.
Yeah. So I'm a director of a community organisation. Dave's one of our volunteers. So Sheffield Renewables, we develop community-owned energy projects. We've got 3 in operation at the moment, and we're looking to develop more at the moment as well. So we mentor, advise, and we work with a variety of organisations, from really small community organisations to larger organisations such as South Yorkshire Police and the Council, to try and help them with their energy needs. So from my point of view, I'm a real fan of community energy. I think it can be, it's sort of one of the cogs in the mechanism for sort of reducing our carbon needs and getting that 2 degrees. And I think one of the biggest impacts that we can have at a local level is through being proactive with things like community energy. So I think community energy addresses 3 key needs. It addresses climate change, energy security, and fuel poverty. And we think we need to engage society at all levels, and this is something that community energy can do, I think, anyway. And that's so that we can deliver a robust strategy for attaining 3 degrees. It's a perfect opportunity for us in helping those who are in most need in our society whilst building this new energy infrastructure. So if we can bring the benefits to the poorer people in our society through things like community energy, we can improve our country as a whole. So it's all about making our energy system work for us and owning our own energy systems. And the other great thing about community energy is it can be the mechanism for speeding up and scaling up the rollout of renewable energy. We have the resources and the know-how to do it. We just need the money and the policy to back it up. So I think policy, Kevin mentioned 3 sort of main things: demand, supply, and policy. And from our point of view, policy is the most important thing. And as I'm sure you're all aware at the moment, the government isn't quite there on policy.
Right. Thanks very much, Julia. So Peter, would you like to?
Well, I'm just going to stroll around for a minute for a reason. So I'm Professor of Chemical Engineering and Chemistry, but I'm also an Associate Fellow in the Understanding of Politics. So part of my role is to look at policy. So I agree that policy is very important, and I echo everything that's been said so far. But we have a huge challenge. We have a government which is in isolation. We have Europe, which is going one way. We have Britain, which is going another way in terms of energy policy. We have the Americas going another way. So while COP21 had some negatives, it also had some positives, and there are some things to strive for. My concern is that we're not going to meet those targets, that there's only going to be one way by 2030 that we are going to achieve that sort of reduction. And that is that maybe as a student, 1 day out of 5 you'll have a lecture in a lecture theatre, and 4 days out of 5 you'll be by torchlight using renewables. But you need the energy to put in there to get the light. So this is why renewables are very important. But as we've seen, I'll get the lights back up to normal now. As we've seen with transportation, aviation is excluded, sea transport is excluded. Those are really essential areas where it's very difficult to decarbonise. If anyone wants to see a road transport vehicle running on a lithium-ion battery, rather than having a diesel tank with 800 kilograms of fuel, you'll have a lithium-ion battery with 52 tons of battery. That's not going to work. That's a whole trailer of an articulated lorry working to haul the long-haul transport. If you need a 52-ton battery to do a lorry, just imagine the size of the battery for the plane. That's not going to take off. Hydrogen, again, you can run a plane on hydrogen. No one's going to fly on a plane powered by hydrogen. It doesn't have the power, and it certainly has certain safety issues. So we're advocating not carbon capture and storage, not enhanced oil recovery. We're advocating carbon capture and utilisation, both for mitigation, to reduce the amount of emissions, but also to remove carbon from the supply chain. So instead of using fossil oil to make chemicals through petrochemical processes, using CO2 to displace that. And at the moment, fossil oil displacement in the chemical industry is 10 times greater than all CCS globally. So it already is making an impact, and we want to make it have a much bigger impact.
Thanks, Peter. On then to questions for the panel. So the first one I have here is from Kathy Aston, I believe it is.
Okay, so I found Kevin's expounding of the physics very interesting. I think the physics is obviously very important, but I think the biggest obstacle to change are social and psychological. So most people don't take this stuff seriously. We do. We got a sense of urgency about this problem, but most people think it's a concern for tree huggers. So I suppose my question is, how do we get that sense of urgency across to everyone else, all our friends and family and our colleagues who are not in this room?
I think it's interesting you say that we do and others don't. I'm not sure how accurate that is.
That's my experience.
Yeah, to some extent, but there are many people involved in issues of climate change, and there are lots of grassroots or broader environmental issues. And it's the sort of arguments that Naomi Klein's made. You know, that there are lots of people out there who are powerless but would like to engage in lots of these issues. Then I think there are lots of people, from what I understand from the survey data that's significantly been done in this country by the people in Cardiff at University, Nick Pigeon and Lorraine Whitmarsh and others, there's a lot of interest in issues of climate change and in the government putting policies forward to try and respond to it. And that's interestingly, that's also the case for the states, and it did go up after Sandy. It dropped a little bit, but it still remained higher than it was before that. I think the latest data is showing about 60% of the population thinks it's a serious issue. So I'm not quite sure that I agree completely that other people aren't so interested. But I think if we want to engage them, what we have to do is act. You know, people need to see examples. We all hear people, espousing like I was, how important climate change is. But actually, what we need to see is how do people live their lives differently, and we need to see those lives looking like good quality lives. So I think, to me, the greatest way that we can get across how important these issues are is to demonstrate with our action. And that's why it's important for universities to do that. If all seats of learning, all academic, higher education, and further education institutes started to demonstrate action along the lines of what the science is calling for, science, of course, which they undertake within those universities, that would be a very, very strong signal to society that it was important. At the moment, what do they see? They see nothing like that. So, I mean, in the end, I think it's that old cliche that actions speak louder than words. So I think we need to start demonstrating how it can be done.
Julie, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think we need to show people the benefits of making these changes, and I think that can sometimes be hard to translate, especially to those people that are struggling to pay their bills as it is. But for those people that are in fuel poverty, if we can make savings for them through renewable energy technologies, installation, retrofit, they'll see the benefits and they might engage more. So that's how I would see our solution.
Peter? Yeah.
Okay, so I see it through education, not just universities, but through schools. If you go into the centre of town, Sheffield City College has 3 wind turbines on the roof, very prominent. Usually 2 are working. No idea what the third one's there for. Hopefully the staff there are teaching the students why those turbines are there. I went to a school in Rotherham a few years ago who installed a wind turbine in the playground, and I asked the head of science and technology what it was doing, and she said, well, it's spinning round and doing things. Had no idea how that would feed into the curriculum. We also need government to be more proactive in promoting green technologies, which at the moment they're not. I was in Parliament before Christmas, and they very proudly announced that out of the 630 MPs, 92 had an interest in science. Not an experience or a background in science, but an interest. And the chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee in the House of Commons at least has an ology. She has a degree in musicology from the University of Oxford. I went onto the Oxford website to see what musicology was. No idea. Still no idea. I think it's It's a technical music degree, but nothing to do with science and technology. So the committees in Parliament are run by people who have no experience with science. And that is a big problem. You go to Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, is a chemical physicist. The Minister for Education and Research, Joanna Vanka, is a scientist. Governments in Europe are run by scientists. And that has a big influence. And Germany is a prime example of that.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next question, because we are obviously fairly tight for time. But if we've got a chance at the end, we can have more general discussion. This next one is from Monica Ortiz.
Hi, this question's for Kevin. I thank you for your talk. I guess I have an issue that leads to a question. Is that you made a strong relationship between taking a flight, rich people taking a flight, and people in developing countries dying. And I guess my issue with that is it portrays people from developing countries as victims. And so my question is, what then is the role of adaptation? What then is the role of resilience if we take that view of cause and effect, flight here, death there? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think they are victims of what we're doing. I mean, we have been knowingly putting this carbon dioxide at very high levels into the atmosphere. We've not chosen to change our behaviour in any way, shape or form. In fact, we've got even worse in terms of our use of energy and our emissions of carbon dioxide. So we have actually chosen to make poorer people around the planet the victims of our profligate ways that we've been living our lives here. That's not to undermine in any way, shape or form the importance of adaptation and resilience. And in fact, I think there's a lot that we can learn from other parts of the world. I have colleagues that looked at this about, in terms of resilience, my guess is probably people on the coastal strip of Bangladesh are much more resilient to changes in weather than we are over here. If their supermarkets don't have food in, they can probably deal with it, as we'd be completely lost over here. So I think in terms of resilience and adaptation, there are lots of lessons that can be learned from other parts of the world. But in terms of mitigation, to try to reduce the amount of resilience and adaptation you have to have, it is our responsibility here. And I don't want to make a one-to-one correlation between a flight and a death, but I think we have to recognise that the science is very clear that rising temperatures are brought about by burning fossil fuels and other things as well, but significantly by burning fossil fuels, and that those rising temperatures will have very negative implications for impacts for other parts of the world, particularly those people who are already vulnerable for a whole suite of other reasons as well, and we're imposing this other additional vulnerability on top of them. So I think, I'm not sure I'm going to have to go back and think if the language I'm using is inappropriate, but I think what I was saying still holds. I'm not sure what is wrong with recognising that they are the victims of our action.
I think there is truth that there are victims because of what you talk about, vulnerability, but to say that, to kind of disregard the collective global action by developing countries and the demand for 1.5 degrees Celsius, the demand for loss and damage from COP21, kind of doesn't give enough credit to the self-sufficiency and intrinsic power of developing countries to fend for themselves. And I just wanted that balance of cause and effect, but also to say that there is capacity in developing countries and there is capacity even in least developed countries. I guess that's just the point I'd like to drive.
Yeah, well, I think we agree then. I mean, there is huge capacity there. There are lots of lessons for us to learn from other parts of the world. I don't see us just demonstrating how things should be done to everywhere else. I mean, there are lessons, two-way lessons to be learned. But on the loss and damage issue, well, on the $100 billion rather per annum in the Paris Agreement, there's $100 billion. Well, that's the discussion. At the moment, there's no agreement as to where that money's going to come from at the moment. And this is per annum to give to the poor parts of the world, like aid, but it's not really, it's reparation in my view. It's to overcome the things that we've caused damage to their societies. That $100 billion, the subsidy according to the IMF last year to fossil fuels was $5.3 trillion. Now that's a direct subsidy and the health subsidy from the damage of fossil fuels, $5.3 trillion. That's 53 times more than the world is prepared to give, but at the moment it's not prepared to find out how it's going to give it, to the poorer parts of the world to deal with climate change. So I think the amount of money that was discussed in Paris was a disgrace. $100 billion per annum is irrelevant. It's 1/30 of the UK economy to the poor parts of the globe. So I think they were treated very badly in the Paris Agreement. But that's not to say they lack capacity. But sometimes they do have, having resources and the wherewithal would help them deal with the repercussions of our actions.
They are a victim of consequence of actions of the developing countries. But there is, certainly in the UK, there's the overseas development aid that's going out in reparation, in effect. 1.5 billion pounds to help developing nations improve their quality of life. That will necessarily have energy implications. So I'm not sure if that's actually helping or hindering the problem, because to have economic growth, it's usually coupled in with energy growth.
Let's move on to the next question then. This is from Steve.
As far as I'm aware, the university has got an aim to be an engine for economic growth. And so this means that researchers like me are encouraged to show how we are using our research to drive economic growth. But because of the link between economic growth and carbon emissions, we're then going to be driving carbon emissions. So how do we square that? How do we reconcile the need to increase economic growth with the need to reduce carbon emissions, particularly through the university's role?
Okay, so is anyone aware of the Keyner identity? So this is something that Bill Gates has picked up on recently. It's a linear equation with 4 terms. You have population. So as population grows, well, population will grow. And if we take that in university terms, we want the university population to grow. So we have an inherent growth within the university. There's services. As population grows, the number of services grow. And you can do this on a university basis, but you can also do it in terms of globality as well, because if we want to grow things across the world, it has an equal effect. So we have the services. The services must grow. For services to grow, we must have energy, because it's energy and services to provide those services. And the 4th term is the carbon emissions, the carbon emitted per unit of energy. So the only way we can get a carbon neutral, not negative, but carbon neutral university or planet is for the C term, the carbon emissions, to be 0. So we have to aim to make that energy term, while energy is growing, we have to make the carbon emissions 0. The only way we can do that is move towards a renewable energy infrastructure.
I think this is one of the problems I have here, this is a fundamental problem, is that we've got this belief, and it is a belief, it's not based on anything, that we have to have economic growth. It is a prerequisite not of contemporary society, of all human societies. And my understanding is from talking to anthropologists about this, and someone else can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that this is quite a new phenomenon. The Egyptians didn't have it, the Romans didn't have it, the Babylonians didn't have it. They expanded their same model, but they didn't have increased material consumption over and above certain levels. And it's interesting with the Egyptian system, I mean, that was what, 4,000 years old? 4,000 years long? I mean, we've struggled after industrialisation after 150 years. But I mean, 4,000 years that lasted for. I'm not saying there weren't some problems with it, there clearly were. But for about 2,000 years of that, the pyramid period, you could have taken someone from the beginning of that period and put them in the end of that period, and they would have recognised everything about that society. Yeah. Could you go back 2,000 years now and bring someone into modern society and say they'd recognise everything about it and they'd recognise the structures and so forth? We have normalised this concept of growth. We have believed these astrologists, sorry, the economists, that actually that is a requirement. So I think, and I'm being a bit unfair about economists there, and the current form of economics that dominates governments are this sort of market-based, near-classical model. But there are plenty of other schools of economics. There are ecological economics, institutional economics. There are lots of other people working in other areas. So I'd recommend people like Herman Daly read his work on steady-state economies. So there are lots of people that are suggesting you can have a very different model for what society has to look like. One of the reasons we have to have growth in our society is because we believe in productivity. And if you're more productive, you have less labour per unit of output. If you have less labour per unit of output, you have to have more output, otherwise people are unemployed. So our particular framework means that we have to perpetuate that system, otherwise you have more and more unemployment. So we could rethink that. You know, there are different ways of running our societies. But I mean, I think it's a disgrace that universities, places of thought, have simply taken this belief, and that is all it is. It is just, you know, I'm not being against religions here, but it's just a religion. It's, you know, we have different religions, and mammon is one of them. You know, money is a religion. And we need to rethink that. And then I think, and as scientists and as engineers and as academics, we should be providing much greater guidance to society of alternative models that are out there. and be more vociferous about it, because actually there was a lot of work on ecological economics, but they are very quiet. They work in their little silos, even though there's many thousands of people working on it. They never get involved in government. So we need to be rethinking a lot of that. And just one on the spirit. Have any read The Spirit Level? The book? Yeah, well, some of you have. But basically that shows, as with energy, that again, you get improved quality of life as your income goes up. Then at some point you no longer get that, and then you just have increased consumption and emissions and no improvement in quality of life. And there is a little sweet spot of countries. Now, there are about 24 countries in that sweet spot, roughly. About 12 of them we think are just passing through it. The other 12 are there, not for, they just happen to be there. They're not chosen it particularly. But those sorts of countries are not the ones we normally think of. They are places like Cuba. They're those sorts of countries. Now, there are lots of problems with those countries as well. But it's interesting that you see high quality of life with relatively low consumption. And why not aim for that rather than this idea, that utopian version that we've all got to be like the Americans or like the Qatarians with very high consumption per capita and no greater quality of life.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that leads us quite nicely on to the next question, which is from Jenny Patient.
Given the scale of what Kevin's laid out before us, and the sort of sickening feeling in the stomach when he got to the end of the bad bit, and then he did actually have a plan, which I love. How can we bring together the people who are prepared to speak out and to lead such a programme to make it happen and overcome what in our little group we were talking about, the political inertia and the need for people to take this on politically, but everywhere in society really. So it's how can we bring those people together who can speak out and lead?
There are many people who are already engaged and prepared to try and make some sort of change. I think, again, it's the action part. How do you make the next move from a group like this, who's probably pretty much all of us here are concerned about these issues, but how do we move that to action? And I think this idea I mentioned before about examples is really important. There was years ago in the time of apartheid, there was a cashier in Dunn's store in Ireland, in Dublin, one of the biggest stores that's in Dublin, and she refused to put South African goods through her till, so she was sacked, because she's only a cashier after all, so you can easily sack them. So she was sacked, but what they didn't realise is she was an obstreperous little devil as well. So she went outside and got a placard and started to campaign. Other people decided to join her, and 2 years later, within 6 months, Dunn's no longer stocked any more apartheid goods. Within 2 years, Ireland had changed its legislation, so it never had any more apartheid goods going through Ireland. Now, that was a cashier that drove change. She didn't require lots of support from the whole of society. She just got up and did what she thought was right. And I was thinking, we're already well ahead of that. We already have groups and colleagues and friends who support our views. So I think we're in exactly the position now to be making those sort of active changes. So I don't think we have to wait for anything else. We are that group.
Julia, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just think being proactive at a local level and trying to engage those people that perhaps aren't sat in the room today. If you can convince one other person that what we're doing is the right way to do it, then that'll help with the change.
Peter?
This is a reasonably large audience, but small in comparison to the population. So you've got to start to build a momentum. So local councils, you live in the community, get the local councils on board. Sheffield is reasonably green, not totally green. But we have the Veolia incineration plant, the energy from waste. That actually does a lot of good for the community. If you go to Calderdale, for example, the heat is dissipated into the atmosphere. They use the electricity, but they don't capture the heat. So they're wasting a lot of energy from a resource that is renewable, because there will be waste. But start at a local level, work at the government level. I think governments are gradually becoming more aware of the issues. They're slow to react, but the more lobbying you do, the better than that will be. If the government don't know what the feeling is, they're not going to act on it.
So we talk to a lot of councillors, and we deal with the council a lot, and actually they are generally really receptive. All councillors, Lib Dems, Labour, Greens, they're all really receptive to what we do and our ideas. The big sort of brick wall for us in the council is that they're risk averse, and they always throw procurement at us. They're risk averse because they're risk averse, and procurement is always an issue. They're worried about the legal ramifications of the projects that they do. So they don't value the carbon savings as much as the money, protecting their money. And you can see that when they have the budget cuts that they do to deal with. It's difficult.
and health and safety as well is always a good get-out clause. But read the I have to stay completely apolitical on this, but read the manifestos of the parties and see which party represents the environment the best.
Perhaps time for one last question. This is from Chris Brains.
Kevin listed quite a lot of actions that we can take to reduce our carbon emissions, behavioural change and that kind of thing. One thing that's perhaps a little bit more controversial is the impact of the meat industry and the contribution of meat in meat production in climate change. How significant does the panel think the impact of the meat industry is in terms of carbon emissions, and what can we do to reduce it, bearing in mind growing demand for meat in developing nations?
We work in agri-tech on the production of low carbon fertilizers. So one of the big drives forward is fertilizers are big emitters. Urea is a big emitter, but because it's derived from fossil fuel. If you can take it away from the fossil fuel supply chain, then it becomes a much better chemical. As for meat, I am gradually turning vegan. I'm down, I think I'm now 5 days a week vegan. And given the choice, I went to the Red Deer yesterday, the engineering common room, and ordered the vegan burger out of choice. That wouldn't have happened a year ago. In terms of meat production, yes, there is a lot of CO2 emissions, but there's also a hell of a lot of CO2 emissions from agriculture, from growing cereal crops, from growing other crops. If you look at biofuels, I mean, biofuels, every crop is a fuel. It's a fuel that, a food is a fuel for the human. Roughly, for every kilojoule of energy you consume in food, you put 10 kilojoules of energy into the process, into the supply chain. So food production is a very, very inefficient process. Meat production is bad, and on environmental grounds, not on ethical grounds, I'm gradually turning vegan. But we have to look at the whole industry. The brewing industry. Does anyone drink beer? That's a huge emitter. That is a really, really potent emitter of CO2 that people still drink.
Luckily, our local brew, Bradfield, have solar panels on their buildings, so you can drink that with a clear conscience.
Yeah. Adams have a carbon neutral beer as well. It's not very good, but their broadside is excellent. Meat is hugely important, and I tend to focus on energy, but I have colleagues that work on the meat side. Or agriculture as an industry is very important, and obviously a shift away from meat. Whether you become vegan or vegetarian, I happen to be vegetarian, but whether you become vegan or vegetarian, you can maybe do that for lots of other sets of reasons, but certainly reducing the quantity of meat that we consume is hugely important. Again, that's an opportunity for universities. University cafeterias could be significantly reducing the amount of meat that they have on their menus. They could also be moving away from meats that have significantly higher methane emissions. So if we look at red meats, beef and so forth, and lamb, they have a very high emissions footprint per useful calorie compared with, say, pigs or chickens. So even if you don't want to become vegetarian, there are options for moving away. So that's really important. And this cultural bit about generally as people get richer, you consume more meat. That actually isn't true. It's certainly the case for China, from my understanding, and that's very much they're following the Western model, and they're following the Western models in terms of diseases as well now. But if you look at India, that's not the case. I understand that India, although it's becoming significantly wealthier, because culturally they have a different attitude towards animals. So they're not seeing a big rise in meat. That's my understanding, a big rise in meat consumption. And I think interesting compared with energy, one thing about food, energy is something we use, but it's not so culturally embedded in our day-to-day activities. Food is absolutely fundamental for how we react, how we link with other people. We go out for a beer with our friends, we go out for a meal with friends and colleagues. It's part of the way that we socialise and interact. So I think it's much more complicated to understand. But very clearly, we have to move away from a high meat diet if we want to have 9 billion people living on this planet with low emissions. So we have to move away from a meat-based diet towards very low levels of meat consumption. They're about what I think very roughly, other people maybe know this better than I do, for every for every useful sort of calorie of meat, we have to put in somewhere between 7 and 13 useful calories of other arable type outputs, other agricultural outputs into that meat. So actually it'd be much better if we could eat that more directly. Then we would have to use much less land. So it's a very, very inefficient process of getting calories into us.
Okay, thanks for that. Can we squeeze in one more quick question then? This is from John Morgan. I think it sums up a key issue for the whole presentation.
I think a lot of these points have been covered already, but I still thought it was important to ask. And how do we convince the politicians of the urgency of the many changes that are needed?
Lobbying. So I think, fortunately, in the last couple of days, the government's changed its view now that academics were going to be banned from lobbying from the 1st of May. Because we're funded by central government through HEFCE and research councils, and therefore it was seen as government lobbying government. Fortunately, they've had the sense to go back on that and reconstitute the regulation. So lobbying is the only way that you can get this forward. You have a constitutional right to lobby your MP, your constituency MP. You can't go to an MP for, I don't know, Hampshire, who happens to have a big farm, and lobby them. It has to be your local MP, but your local MP has a constitutional right to put any question that you raise through to the Department of Energy and Climate Change, Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So if you have a question, bring that up with your local MP. That is by far the easiest way to get through.
Yeah, we find that the local MPs engage with us most when we give them practical and easy ways to help us. So if we lay it out to them, what they've got to say, what they've got to do, they're a lot more willing to engage with us. So I think you've got to go to them with the answers.
I think a lot of them recognise the urgency of the issues. And I think this is the same for a lot of very senior people in companies as well. And they just are, as everyone else, they're just running scared of acting. I mean, it's odd when you talk to... I've had a few dinners, and I wouldn't recommend the food, but anyway, with the CEO from Shell. And I completely oppose what they do. I much prefer Exxon to Shell because it's a wolf in wolf's clothing rather than a wolf in sheep's clothing. But when I have dinner with people like that, what's interesting is you say, well, why not try this, this and this? Well, what can I do? I've got a board. You talk to politicians, you talk to ministers. Well, I can't do anything. I've got the voters. You talk to the voters. I can't do anything because the minister's doing nothing. Everyone thinks there is someone else that's stopping them acting. And it's not as if the politicians don't think these issues are important. Some of them do. Many politicians think these issues are really important, but they're really scared of acting because they think we're going to vote them out. So I think we have to be more engaged for them to realise there's a big support base. But I also think it's not just about lobbying. Lobbying is important, and there are some ways to do it as well. It's worth bearing in mind. Chris Smith told me this years ago, who used to be an MP. He said, for every letter he gets, he knows that 30 to 300 people will vote on that point. Because most people don't bother writing letters, but they will vote on the point. And he says, if you have a majority of 300, you get a handful of letters on a point, you could lose your seat if you don't support that point. So actually, letters and lobbying our MPs is hugely important. It's not one voice. When they get that one voice, most of them are reasonably astute, know that lots of other people support that view. So we should be lobbying, and we can be a bit more sophisticated how we do it. We can also lobby ministers. And the other great thing is ministers have constituencies. And you just pointed out before, constituency MPs are required to respond to their constituents. So you don't have to, even if their minister's not in your constituency, find someone else whose constituency they're in. And I've done this. I've had other people do this for me. So I've been able to meet with ministers in their constituencies because they're forced to go to them. So there are quite a lot of tricks you can use to make the political system engage with us as their, remember, they're our employees. But I also think ultimately we have to act. We have to act, not just wait for them. So action by us, I keep banging on about this, action by us is really important. It's not a top-down or bottom-up process. It's a partnership. They have to see examples of what can be done. And if no one's given examples of what can be done, why on earth do we think they're going to come up with policies? So us demonstrating what can be done gives them an opportunity to think, well, what would you need to do to scale that up? What are the policies that are necessary? So universities should be one of the leading sets of institutions to demonstrate what can be done. We have all the information, all the wherewithal, and we're not that strapped for cash compared with some other institutions. And yet we are still choosing to do nothing.
Just to follow up, two things from that. Lobbying and letters, not emails. Emails just get put in the bin. So a written letter It's one of the few reasons that there is still to write a written letter, and that's to an MP or a minister, because it will be acted on. And the secondly is if you are lobbying, lobby with evidence. Don't lobby with feelings. You know, if you've got a passion for a subject, that can often hide the facts behind that subject. So make sure that you have the hard facts for the politician, because they have researchers who can see through different things. I've had things passed back from government to look at where they know they're being hoodwinked by groups who are claiming things that are not true. So, and that's groups of academics, I would add. But make sure that that your facts are there, and that you, under no circumstances, go more than one page. They won't read more than one page. So one page of hard facts, and then you will begin to be noticed.
One quick point on that, don't call it lobbying.
No.
Yeah. As academics, you might go along with passion, but we do not go to lobby. We go to inform. You know, I appreciate that we need more scientists and so forth in government, but I do not want to be ruled by scientists. It would be a disastrous place to live. We need a wide portfolio of people. So, scientists and academics, not wider range of social science, academics, and humanities are there to inform the government process. So, other people have a vested interest, may lobby. That's not our job. To do that. And don't remember, there are also other groups into Parliament as well. And councils are very important in this. It's not just about the upper echelons of government. Actually, who delivers in the end are generally it's local people, local councils and so forth. But also things like the all-party groups. There are all-party groups for all sorts of things, everything ranging from jazz to climate change. So you can engage with the all-party groups in the House of Commons. There's the select committee hearings, and they put recalls out for evidence. You're allowed to submit evidence into those. And when I talk quite a lot in the House of Commons, and they regularly say, why are we not hearing from academics? Academics run scared of talking to politicians. They want to hear what we have to say. So, engage with them. And you can quite easily get invited into the House of Commons to talk about the issues, provided you've got evidence. And they want to hear what we have to say. It's a much, much more open process than most of us give credit to.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And we're just going to round up now. It's time to finish. Rachel's going to wrap things up, aren't you? Just to say that the questions that people have asked, obviously we've only had a chance to ask a small fraction of the questions, but we will be putting the questions up on the CNU website, so it will form a basis of what we hope is an ongoing conversation.